Turn your Bibles to Mark chapter 9, verse 2. Mark chapter 9, we're ready for verse 2. It's good to see everyone tonight. Those that are on the phone. With regards to the calendar on the front of last week's bulletin, I will take part in blame for that. Jay set it up for me so beautifully, and I appreciate that so much. Such a big help to me. But I looked at that and I said, no, that's not right. I don't know how to fix it, though. And about the time it got through printing, I said, yeah, I remember how Jay told me to fix it. But I'd already printed all of them, so I just couldn't go back. So, and I meant to tell him that when I sent them out, they were messed up, and I forgot to tell him. So we'll try to do better. And like I say, Jay does so much in that area, and I appreciate that. It does help me out a lot. Mark chapter 9, verse 2. Before we get to that point, we were asked last week, Ken, I believe, asked us the question with regards to the word gospel. It was found in part of our text that we studied last week. Was the word gospel ever used previous, say, to, let's just say, the book of Acts in any other passages? And so I went back and looked. Of course, we know that the word gospel just simply means good news. Euangelion or euangelizomai. It just means good news, the good news. And so it is used in several passages. If you want to write these down, if you're interested in studying them, Matthew chapter 11, verse 5, and with that, Luke chapter 7, verse 22, that's the same passage where Jesus says, go tell John that the lame walk and the blind, or the lepers cleanse, the deaf can see, and that the gospel is preached. Luke 7, verse 22 is the... Also, it's found in Matthew chapter 24, verse 14, where it talks about the gospel of the kingdom. And this is right there in Matthew chapter 24. Remember where Jesus talks about the destruction of the temple, and the question, there's actually two questions that are asked. When will this be, and when will be the coming of the Lord? And the Lord answers those two questions. He first answers what are the signs, basically, to the coming of the destruction of the temple. And in Matthew 14 or 24, verse 14, he's talking about that first answer there. And he says, talked about this is the gospel of the kingdom that would be preached to all nations. It's also found in Matthew chapter 26 and verse 13, where woman anoints the feet of Jesus. Remember it right there at the end of his life. And Matthew says that this gospel is to be preached to the whole world. It's found in Mark chapter 10, verse 29, where Jesus makes the statement, no one's left house or brother or mother or sister or father, excuse me, or wife for my name's sake and for the gospel's. If you're writing these down, Matthew 24, verse 14, also Mark 13:10 is the same text. I mean, it uses that there. One that didn't come to mind, that should have come to mind when Ken asked the question, is Mark 16:15, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. And one more, Luke chapter 4, verse 18, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. Jesus talks about, really, it's at the beginning of his ministry. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He sent me to heal the brokenhearted, preach deliverance to the captives, the recovering of sight to the blind, and to set at liberty them that are bruised. But he says that he was given the opportunity and the chance to preach the gospel. So those are the times in which the term gospel or good news is mentioned before what we would call the gospel, before the actual good news with regards to the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ came about. And those are the times in basically Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that the word gospel is used. So, any questions about that? Good. No. Mark chapter 9, verse 2. is, as I said last week in the close of the lesson, this is one of those great stories that I still remember when I was a child going to Bible school, and some of my Bible school teachers using the old flannel graph, those pictures and the flannel boards. That's how I remember this being taught. And I always enjoyed this story, if you will, this event in the life of Christ. Let's look at it. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John and led them up on a high mountain apart by themselves. And He was transfigured before them. His clothes became shining, exceedingly white, like snow, such as no launderer on earth can whiten them. This is, I think, we understand it, but it's hard to grasp from the standpoint of how did it happen. Well, we don't really know how it happened. It is interesting that the word transfigure is the idea of change that comes from within, not a change that came from without. And we think of a change that comes from without. Well, this is a change that came from within. And Jesus began to shine brighter. Mark says brighter than anybody could launder at that time. That Jesus' whole countenance, His whole appearance changed from the standpoint of He's bright. His clothes are bright. You can imagine just, if you will, the aura that comes off of Jesus because of this change that occurs. Is it miraculous? Yeah, I think so. Is it an event that has not been duplicated? I don't know of a time in which it has, in which it was in Scripture. Jesus is changed, though. And Elijah, verse 4, it says, appeared to them with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. So Elijah and Moses are talking with Jesus, and Peter, James, and John are seeing this, as you can imagine. And Peter answered and said to Jesus, Rabbi. Now, don't make too much out of that. You see the word rabbi with regards to Jesus more in the book of John than you see it in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's not to say that it's not there. It is here in this text. But the word rabbi is just an old Jewish term that just simply means master teacher. And so it's a reference to, and they are acknowledging the teaching and the position of Jesus with regards to themselves. Master teacher. What? Well, rabbi, it's good for us to be here. Let us make 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah, because he did not know what to say, for they were greatly afraid. Who wouldn't have been afraid? Who wouldn't have been scared? Who wouldn't have had some fear about them when they see this change? Peter was afraid, and evidently so were James and John. And as they were afraid, Peter then seemingly has what he thinks is a good solution. He says, now it's good for us to be here, but let's make a tent. Or as he says here in verse 5, he says 3 tabernacles. The word tabernacle there just means tent. Skene, tent. Let's make 3 tents. One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Now, we'll just say it right here. It will bear repeating as we get into this text. Moses and Elijah basically were representing the old law. Moses with regards to the law and Elijah with regards to the prophets. And so they were representing, if you will, the old law. They appeared in a form that evidently was recognizable. Now, how did Peter, James, and John know that this was Moses and Elijah? Don't know. The reason they don't know is because Scripture doesn't tell us. Is it that Jesus told them, let me introduce you to Moses and let me introduce you to Elijah? I don't know. That could have been. Could it have been that they overheard Jesus just talking to them? Could have been. It doesn't tell us, and to be honest, it doesn't matter. They did recognize that these were folks that needed to be recognized. And Peter wanted to, and let's commend him, Peter wanted to do something special for them. Let's don't sit in judgment and criticize him. Let's hold him to a good account. Peter wanted to do something good for them. And so he says, Lord, what if we build a tent? What if we build something to house these people? A tent from the standpoint of a tent as we think of a tent. Now, maybe we should back up. Their tents were more what we would call a lean-to. They were not the actual pup tents or things like that. They were more like lean-tos, what we would call a lean-to. But it's an idea of a housing. Let's build a housing for Moses and for Elijah and even for you. And notice then verse 7 kind of helps us on that. A cloud came and overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud saying, "This is my beloved Son, hear him." Some have, if you read religious books, some refer to this cloud as Shekinah. Now, Shekinah was a cloud that was said to be God that came into the temple when it was opened in the Old Law, in the Old Testament. When the temple was opened, there was supposedly thought and taught amongst the Jewish circles that a cloud came in and resided in the temple, and that cloud, Shekinah, was God. And so those that write about that with regards to this then want us to think, and it is their belief, their understanding, as they look at this text, that if the temple housed God, then let's build some sort of housing, if you will. Even though tent is temporary, let's build a housing place for Moses and for Elijah and for Jesus. But then this voice from heaven shouts out, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. Hear him." Now, we've had the voice one other time. It is baptism. And we're going to have it another time. Do you remember when or where? John 12. Very true. Right there. We will hear that voice. The difference, the first time at the baptism, remember what was said? "This is my beloved Son," right? This time, God adds the words what? Hear him. The point then that God was trying to make was what? The authority of Christ as opposed to the old law. And so that's when you walk away and you scratch your head and say, what was the purpose of the transfiguration? I think there's 2-3 stories or 2-3 lessons you can learn, but that's the number one lesson. Jesus is to be listened to. Now, who to a degree had already recognized that in this story? Peter, right? Rabbi, master teacher. And so the affirmation then comes from God. Jesus is the one you need to listen to. And suddenly, we're about to end this and open it up for anyone. Suddenly, when they had looked around and saw no one anymore, but only Jesus with themselves, as they came down from the mountain, He commanded them that they should tell no one that the things that they had seen till the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept this word to themselves, questioning what the rising from the dead meant. Now let's stop right there because there's a little change in thought. Look at the text. All of a sudden, Moses and Elijah are gone. So you had, put all the story together. You had the changing of Jesus. You had the appearance of Moses and Elijah. It evidently took a little while because it says that Moses and Elijah were talking with Jesus. So all this didn't just whoosh. There was a little time that lapsed. How much? Don't know. Why? Text doesn't tell us. Then you have this voice from heaven. Well, let's back up. You have Peter saying, "Lord, let's build a monument, if you will. Let's build a place to house these folks." And then the point is made by God, no, listen to Jesus. And then Jesus did what seemingly would be the unthinkable. Don't tell anybody. Why? We can only assume, right? We can only assume. We could assume, I think in this case, we could assume, and it would be a bad assumption, but it could be an assumption, that Jesus told them not to tell so that they would tell. That's always possible. You know, when you tell people don't, they usually do, right? But it could also be the fact that he knew we're getting close to the end, but we're not at the end, and we don't need anyone to stop Jesus from fulfilling His mission and His purpose and His ministry. And surely if people got wind of the fact that God spoke and said, listen to Jesus, that somebody would want to stop what needed to take place. Now, let me say, that is also an assumption. I can't tell you the why Jesus told them. I can only tell you the fact that Jesus said, don't tell. And to their credit, notice what it says. So they kept this word to themselves. In other words, they listened to what He said. They said, okay, you don't want me to tell? We won't tell. We'll keep it confidential. You know, there are things that are confidential. Back several years ago, Suzanne and I had a pup, a dog, that died. We'd had him for a long time, and he died. And I wrote a bulletin article about it because, to be honest, it really hurt. Anytime you have a pet, you love those pets, and they are part of the family. And when something happens to them, it really hurts. Well, one night I had come home and I'd always let him out of his pen and he'd stay with me in the yard. And one night he was just at my heels. And I realized something was wrong, and about 2 hours later, as I was beside him, he was dead. And but I wrote a bulletin article about Sparky dying, and I told them, I told the members at Pomona, I said, but you're safe. I said, many of the things that I knew that are kept in confidence, he's the only other one that knew. And they're gone. And I won't tell anybody. Well, there are things that you keep in confidence. There are things that Jim's business, that Jim has to keep in confidence. Preachers, elders have to keep things in confidence. That's just a reality. These fellows evidently kept this in confidence, and so we commend them for their keeping in confidence. And it is that point in time, though, that Jesus then tells them with regards to the fact that He is going to die and that He is going to rise again from the dead. Now, this is not the first time that He's told them that. But the apostles, bless their hearts, and you can say that, in the South you can say that, but bless their hearts, they didn't always grasp what they were told. And it was hard for them to grasp this idea. And so they need to ask questions. But we're going to stop her here. Anything we missed or anything you'd like to add or say? Yes. Yeah. 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 Yeah, that's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. That's a great point, and I should have brought it up. But go back to Job. Job 14:14. If man die, shall he live again? That's the question Job asked. And if if theologians are right, chronologically, Job may have been one of the first books of the Bible written. Now, I'm not talking about the events in them, but I'm talking about as far as, who wrote what first. Job may have been one of the first books written. And so early on, if that's true, then early on, there's an understanding of a resurrection. Now, how did, and always the question, if a man dies, shall he live again? And if he does, then there is a life after life, so there has to be some sort of life beyond. And so there's always that question and always that wondering, isn't there? Through the years, I have preached a series of lessons on death and the afterlife, or I've taught it in Bible classes. And a lot of it is, you read between the lines and you kind of fudge on some things seemingly. And in the end you say, well, in many ways this doesn't matter. But it's always been one of the most talked about series that I've ever done, because we all wonder. And we wonder how it'll all fit in. But yes, there was. And how they recognized Moses and Elijah, I don't know. That's a great point. Yeah. Yes, yeah. 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 That's exactly right. And that's something that I wonder. I've wondered it from this end. If I had been the teacher in Jesus' place, and I was trying to get a following, I was trying to get disciples to follow me and listen to what I had to say. Of course, Jesus was able to do this because He was God in the flesh, and He knew what was going to happen. But would I have enough forethought to have planned for the future? Jesus, in getting these folks to follow Him, when He's going to die the way He's going to die. Now, the prophets had prophesied about the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But in dying that way, most groups, what would have happened to them? They would have spread, scattered, and then died, right? Because the leader is dead. But Jesus was always trying to get these folks to understand, because He knew what was going to happen. And so He was teaching them. Good point.
One thing that always comes interesting here is that, when it says that Peter didn't know what to say because they were frightened.
Yeah.
Now, they're frightened because they saw ghosts.
Yeah.
What we consider that kind of day. But then the cloud speaks.
Yeah.
And, if you think about the cloud, God apparently sounds a lot like the girl. That's what you kind of think.
That's what you think. Yes.
And I don't know what was there, what happened with the cloud, but that would have been a lot stranger to me than to these two people maybe that were dead.
Yeah.
But it doesn't say anything about that. But I just wonder how God said something to the people.
Yeah.
Instead of it being with thunder and lightning, it had to have some authority to it.
Yes.
Because He's sitting there saying, this is my son. And so they would have listened and they heard.
Yeah.
So there was some authority, but we don't know how that came across either. But
No.
we draw the line seeing ghosts, but it's not talking.
Not true. Not true. But the point that should be made is that they were afraid or they feared. And so it created a feeling within them that was like, what is going on? Anything else? All good. Yes. 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 He's that impetuous guy. He's that one that speaks up first. He's the one that drew the sword. Remember, cut off the ear, Malchus' ear, and he was always doing that, always speaking up. Well, they began to question then the rising from the dead. Now, it's interesting because a little later on they're going to question his death when Jesus talks about it. They're going to question, we don't understand the dying. But at least in this incident, and maybe it's because they saw Moses and Elijah, what's this resurrection? Explain to us the resurrection, basically, is what they're saying, or you could say. Notice verse 11 says, they asked him, saying, why do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? Now, Elijah here, Elijah is John the Baptist. But this is actually a reference back to Malachi chapter 3, verse 1, and Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 and 6. In which Malachi, the prophet, talks about the coming of a messenger. Of course, he doesn't call him John, but he talks about the coming of one and the preparation that will be made with regards to, by this one, to Jesus. And notice the answer that Jesus gave them. Indeed, Elijah is coming first and restores all things, and how is it written concerning the Son of Man, that he must suffer many things and be treated with contempt? But I say to you that Elijah has come. Now, Malachi was one from a standpoint of chronology again. Now remember, let's note the fact that the Bible, as it is today, Genesis through Revelation, is put together not necessarily in the order in which they were written chronologically. Order of events, yes, but it's more groupings, because you have books of wisdom, books of poetry, you have books of the prophecies, major and minor prophets, and then you have, of course, the law in the Old Testament. You get to the New Testament, you have the good news, the gospel according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Then you have the history of the church, Acts, and then you have Paul's writings that are by no means arranged chronologically. But Malachi is one of the last of the Old Testament books to be written chronologically. Then there's a period of 400 years in between, say, the last, if you will, communication from God in Old Testament times and the beginning of Jesus here upon the earth. And so there is a period of time in which this prophecy, a little over 400 years, Malachi, I think, dated somewhere in the 432 BC era. And then depending on how you want to look at this calendar, it's around 29 or 32, depending upon which calendar you want to use. So you're talking about nearly 500 years later that they're asking this question. So there's been 500 years, give or take a few years, of course, in which this prophecy the word of this prophecy has been spread. And Jesus says now, the scriptures say, well, Elijah's coming and how he'd be treated. He says, I want you to know Elijah has come. And you remember what they did to him? Well, we do. He didn't fare well, if you will. His end was terrible. And so he says, you remember what they did to him? And he said, they did to him whatever they wished, as it is written of him. And so, as was said, the Lord is preparing for his end. Elijah did come. Elijah did come, as was said. He came from the standpoint of John. And you remember how they treated him. And he said, look what they'll do with regards to the Son of Man. He must suffer many things and be treated with contempt. And he was. What he endured for all of us. Why he endured it? It was because of us. And we are blessed because of it. Anything else? One other thing that I was going to say, that even, I think, makes the appearance of Moses and Elijah so fascinating, and the fact that they recognized them. Moses had been dead for about 1,500 years, and Elijah had been dead for about 900 years at this point. So, how they recognized them, I don't know. But they did. Anything else? So Jesus is getting them ready. And as He gets them ready, He's trying to point them to a direction where they understand, so that they, in understanding, will be able to move forward. I think this is probably a good place to stop, because the next section is really verses 14 through 29, so it's kind of a lengthy section. The preparation which Jesus tried to give, not just Peter, James, and John, but the apostles and all that followed Him, was, as we said a while ago, very vital. Because upon really the apostles stood mankind even today. If when they saw Jesus crucified, not just the apostles, but the others as well, the other followers, when they saw Him upon the cross, and as they went by and viewed Him dying on the cross, if they had simply gone home, closed their doors, and never said anything and never done anything, and said, well, that was fun while it lasted, we today would not have what we have. And admittedly, I understand everybody can say, and I think you would be right in saying, well, therein lies the providence of God. Therein lies God's working. Well, yes, absolutely. God doing His part. But also the fact that there was faith in these folks' lives that said, truly, this was the Son of God. And He was worth following when He was here upon this earth. And the teachings that He left behind were and are worth following today. Now, just as a side note, just to get you to think, they didn't have any of that written down at that point in time. Jesus' teachings, if you will, went for a period of time, and they were passed down. Could somebody have written them down? Sure. And are there writings at the time of Jesus' life? Yes. Not as we think of them from the standpoint of inspired, but writings that they could have written down with regards to what He said, yeah. And so Jesus' ministry went forth on the basis and on the backs, really, of just those people at that day. Now, I say that to make this application. Who knows how long the Lord is going to allow this world to stand? Only He knows. Could He come tonight? Yes. Could He come tomorrow? Yes. Could it be 500 years or 1,000 years from now? Yes. I don't know. Jesus said He doesn't even know when He's coming back. If Christianity is to be alive, ever how long that is, that this world will stand, it stands on, at least for this point in time, and at this point in time, it stands upon our shoulders. And so we have the responsibility to make sure that we hold to the truth, that we hold to the gospel, so that the gospel then, in future generations, if the world, like I say, if the world's still standing, that in future generations, the gospel will still be present and still be taught. Now, having said that, let me give another side note. I know some would say and might say, God will make a way. And I believe that wholeheartedly. But we also have to remember that we can be and are part of that way.